Supposed Bible contradiction. Did Jesus carry his cross or not? In the Synoptics, it says Simon of Cyrene carried the cross for Jesus. But John doesn't mention Simon and instead says, "So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." So skeptics will argue we have a contradiction. John says Jesus carried his own cross, but the Synoptics say Simon bore the cross. Marco Marino says, "The Gospel of John presents a narrative of Jesus' path to the cross that markedly diverges from the accounts found in the Synoptic Gospels. Unlike the Synoptics, where Simon of Cyrene is compelled to assist Jesus with the cross, John empathetically states that Jesus carried his own cross the entire way to Golgotha." Chris Keith says, "Whereas Mark claims that Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus' cross for him, John specifies that Jesus carried his cross himself." But other scholars have addressed this and argued there is no apparent contradiction. First, Mike Licona points out that it was common in ancient texts for a writer to spotlight one person and omit others that were present. For example, Plutarch wrote in Life of Lucullus that several leading men worked hard to convince Rome to grant Lucullus a triumph. But in Life of Cato Minor, Plutarch spotlights Cato as the one who did this and doesn't mention that others worked towards this goal, even though Plutarch was aware it wasn't just Cato. In Life of Caesar, Caesar brought Crassus and Pompey before the populace in order to have them to declare their support for his proposed laws. But in Life of Cato Minor, in Pompey, Crassus is omitted. This doesn't mean Plutarch was contradicting himself. He's merely spotlighting Pompey and the other lives, but didn't in the Life of Caesar. Something similar is probably going on in the Gospel of John. John wanted to spotlight Jesus to make a theological point. As F.F. Bruce said, in stating that Jesus went out carrying his cross, literally carrying the cross for himself, John is not deliberately contradicting the synoptic account of Simon the Cyrene, whose services were commandeered by the military to carry Jesus' cross after him. He is rather emphasizing that, as at his arrest in the garden, Jesus is still in command of the situation. He is taken to the place of execution, it is true, but he is no reluctant victim, compelled to go whether he would not. He goes with his executioners of his own volition and carries the cross for himself. So it is likely John is merely using a common literary device of the time and spotlighting Jesus to signify to his readers that Jesus is still in control of the situation. Additionally, it is unlikely the Synoptics are intending to suggest that Simon carried the cross the whole way for Jesus. D.A. Carson reminds us that Mark and Luke say that Roman soldiers compelled Simon, who was coming in from the country. This implies Jesus carried his cross to the city gate and could not go any further because of the torture that he had already endured. So Simon carried it the rest of the way for him. This is also the implication in Matthew 27, because Matthew wrote as they went out. This suggests Simon was compelled to help at a point along the way. Carson says, despite the brutal beatings, Jesus went out and carried the cross member as far as the gate of the city, where he collapsed in weakness from pain and loss of blood, and where the soldiers impressed Simon, who Mark says was on his way in from the country. So the Synoptics do not seem to claim that Simon carried the cross the whole way for Jesus, but only part of the way. Therefore, John does nothing wrong in spotlighting Jesus and omitting Simon. Jesus did carry his cross for part of the way, which is the traditional understanding. As C.H. Dodd said, the hypothesis on which the statement of John and Mark have commonly been harmonized, that Jesus broke down under the weight of the cross and was then relieved by Simon, deserves perhaps more respect than some other harmonizing hypotheses. Quite apart from the statement, in John 19:17, we should be justified in assuming that Jesus, like any other prisoner, condemned to crucifixion, left the precincts of the court carrying his own cross. This was normal practice, and in default of information to the contrary, we might be reasonably certain that it was followed in this case. Mark does not in fact contradict it. The conscription of Simon is clearly an emergency operation and not part of the normal planned procedure. That Jesus went forth carrying his own cross, but later had to be relieved of it, is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the evidence. So when we look at the data and apply the principle of charity, there is no reason to infer that John contradicts the Synoptics. John is merely spotlighting Jesus, and the Synoptics are not saying that Simon carried the cross the whole way. As Dodd notes, harmonizing them is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.